Yeah, I pasted the question here, Umesh.
The Christmas Island frigatebird actually it has a pretty large range, and so it's been recorded in Indian waters, and therefore it's on the bird list of India, and so that's why it comes in as being a critically endangered species that is also on the India bird list.
Yeah, the question is from Bindu. I think she's not here. Anyway, yeah.
Oh, okay, but this will be uploaded, right? So
Yeah, yes.
yeah. I think I'm not entirely sure. I think the reason why Christmas Island frigate enters into Indian waters is because it's been recorded from the Nicobar Islands or the Andaman and Nicobar group, and that's why it's a Southeast Asian species, and because the Andaman and Nicobar Islands are more sort of Southeast Asian in terms of location, that's why the part of the range of the Christmas Island frigate is also the either the Nicobars or the Andamans and the Nicobars.
So those who are in the live, if any of you have any questions, as I said, or if any of you have any comments, please you can share in the chat box, or else you want to unmute and say, yeah, that's both fine. So today we are discussing about avian conservation concepts lecture. Yep. Please post your questions.
Yeah, just to sort of quick recap. I think mostly talking about things like when we're talking about concepts in conservation, we're mostly talking about things like um, climate change, the loss and degradation of natural habitats, things like hunting and poaching, basically things that threaten bird populations and bird communities, and how they might influence those populations and communities.
Amrita, what do you suggest we do?
Yeah, so we can do one thing if there is no questions in the live session. So there are, I can see, yeah, 7, 10, 8 participants have joined. If none of you have any questions, then we'll wind up the session.
Yeah, I'm Gautama.
Yeah, yeah.
I don't have any question as such. Um, I heard through all the 5 case studies and the talk by Professor Umesh Srivastava. They're all very well made. Uh, it just gave a very good feel that things are happening. The case studies, particularly, they had highlighted, the speakers have made that they were given very limited time. With that limited time, they had made excellent presentations about the efforts that those are going on. It felt good. I think that many more things are happening and should happen so that we uh, keep going forward. And when then the case study which was presented by Professor Umesh, when he talked about a 2 square kilometer area with 20 birds in that place and how there is effort to revive them or just there. It's a very, I couldn't imagine that this is the set of challenges or scenarios what we need to face are there, situations to handle. It felt good, and many other efforts are also are very commendable and felt good. And maybe so that things
Thank you,
can
Gopinath.
happen. Now that there are not many questions. Yes.
I think
Yes.
there's a lag between the.
Okay. Yes, yes, there is some lag in the internet connectivity and
Yeah,
yeah,
something.
yeah, yeah.
Well, I just want to point out that the case study that I had sort of presented regarding the bone chickler, that is um, uh, that effort of conservation has largely been by the Bogan community. It's their land. They sort of traditionally own and manage that land, and it's because of their sort of kindness and generosity, and their willingness to say, all right, we're going to put aside all of this land to protect this species. Um, Yes, it's quite a quite an admirable thing that the Bugun community of Sinchung has done. Well, I've got a couple of questions in the chat box now. Shruti asks if you could please explain biotic homogenization. Yes, biotic homogenization is a process that occurs as a response to. Sorry, just 1 minute. Sorry, I just got interrupted. Biotic homogenization is a process that occurs in response to um, global change drivers. So, to respond to things like climate change and things like habitat loss. Because when climate change happens and habitat loss happens and habitat degradation happens, the loss of species in degraded or otherwise modified habitats is non-random. So let's say you've got 6 different bird communities, right? You've got one in the Andes, one in the Amazon, one in West Africa, one in Southeast Asia, two in India, right? So you've got 5 or 6 bird communities, and all of these bird communities are being affected by deforestation. So when you cut down the forest, then the bird community in the degraded forest looks very different from the bird community in the intact forest. But the species that are lost when you go from intact forest to degraded forest, almost always have predictable traits. Large species tend to be lost. Species that are poor dispersers, which can't move very well, tend to be lost. Certain dietary groups, like insectivorous birds, tend to be at greater risk from all of these things. So when you move to a new community, you're moving towards smaller species that can tolerate those new conditions. So you're selecting for small species that are generalists and can have and have good ability to move between habitats. And so wherever you do this deforestation, right, whether you do it in the Andes, you do it in the Amazon, or you do it in Africa, or you do it in India, um, the new community on that degraded area will tend to be smaller generalists that can disperse widely. So what's happening is across forests across the world, the kinds of species that you see will be similar. The kinds of species that you see in degraded forest patches will be similar to each other in terms of their traits, in terms of their properties. And so basically what's happening is then the communities in these disturbed forests are becoming more and more homogenized. So they're becoming more and more similar in terms of the kind of species that they can support. And that's what's called biotic homogenization. So if you went to primary intact forest and you looked at the range of body masses that you see, you'll tend to see very large birds and a number of small species. But those large birds tend to be lost first because of degradation, and so it's all become the degraded habitat now has all small species, and so everywhere you go, the degraded habitat will have small species, smaller than intact forests, and that's what the process of biotic homogenization is. Where biotic, the word biotic there, homogenization is basically meaning things are becoming more and more similar to each other, right? And biotic in this context is that it's the biological traits of these species, body size, dispersal ability, whether you're a generalist or whether you're a specialist, those are what are becoming more and more similar to each other with degradation. Is that clear, Shruti? Is that making sense? Okay, great. Um, I have another question. Maybe which is at what point in a population's decline should a species be moved from wild monitoring to a captive breeding program? What is the biggest risks of domestication in those settings? Like like many things in ecology and conservation, the answer to that is it depends. Um, It depends on what kind of species we're talking about, depends on the kinds of threats that those species are facing. I'll just say a couple of sentences and then maybe Moshmi can also elaborate on that. So there have been species like the Hawaiian crow that are no longer present in the wild, they're only in captivity, they're only found in captivity. And so the captive populations, at what point in the decline should you move things into um, captivity? So I'll just type this in the chat box. So Carl Jones, who did a lot of work in Madagascar, Madagascar being an island, a lot of species have already gone extinct from Madagascar, and a lot of species were on the brink of extinction, like I'm saying Madagascar, Mauritius, like the Mauritius kestrel. Uh, there were only 4 individuals in the wild, and it was obviously on the brink of extinction. And Carl Jones, who was a conservationist, he actually brought those 4 Mauritius kestrels into captivity, started a captive breeding program, and now the Mauritius kestrel is doing very well in the wild. So in that case, even as low as 4 was still um, not late enough to resurrect that species. But there could be other species, for example, other species that 4 might be too low. So, Mosme, do you have any insights in this?
Yeah, I agree with what you said, Umesh. But and other factors to take into account is also for certain species there is existing expertise on how to breed them in captivity. So that also becomes a major factor on in our confidence in taking that those species into captivity and start captive breeding programs. Like for instance, the GIB effort that has started in India that relied a lot on all the Middle East program on other busted species. So they had been working there for a long time, and many of those experts could come in and help our teams take it up, and that has contributed to that being successful. Second thing, as Umesh pointed out, that number is sometimes you just have to work with what you have, as he pointed out in the case of Mauritius kestrel. But one thing interesting is like I was working with vultures and with their genetic makeup that is there in the captive population within India. And for long-lived species, the interesting thing is they take a lot of time to lose the existing genetic variability. So as long as you have like a good representation of individuals from, if you have the opportunity to collect individuals from different part wherever they are remaining, you are still able to capture a lot of the genetic diversity that the species has and carry it forward through captive breeding. But I think for smaller species which don't live for that long, that might be quite tricky. So there are some examples from New Zealand where they have done captive breeding for island species, and there certain populations have just crashed because the individuals that they could start with were all inbred and just couldn't contribute enough genetic viability to the future populations. But at the end of the day, sometimes you just have to take a call on. You can't really take a decision about it. You just have to work with what you have.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, like Moshmi was pointing out, if you know, if you can sort of borrow information from closely related species, um, then you probably have more information going in setting up a captive breeding program like for the Great Indian Bustard, where people have been breeding bustards in the Middle East in captivity for a long time. Yeah, and so, for example, if one were to do this with the Bugul Leochicla, which has only 14 to 20 individuals left in the wild, then we probably know quite a bit about how to raise it because its closest relative, the Eneshan Leochicla, has been maintained in captivity for decades. And so we know what their feeding habits are, what the birth rates are, how many eggs they lay, and what the incubation time is, what the feeding, how long the parents feed the chicks. All of that information is available from a very closely related species. But if we do it for another species that has never been bred in captivity and its close relatives have never been bred in captivity, that would be far more challenging.
Yeah. An additional point is, just because a bird is found in captivity or it is in trade doesn't mean we have the required information to start a captive breeding program. And that comes from, our observations from Southeast Asia, where a lot of the songbirds are in trade, but they have not been successful in breeding them in captivity. That's why the trade continues from the wild all the time, because although they can keep them in captivity, they die out very soon and they're just replaced from the wild. So they don't have the know-how to breed them in captivity.
Right. That Indonesian songbird trade is for a completely different reason. That's got nothing to do with conservation at all. It's for singing competitions between birds, and then whoever wins, whichever bird has the best song, the owner gets a hefty prize, and that's what the songbird trade in Southeast Asia is. Do birds usually get better, more to least concern once we label them as near threatened? Or do we get worse and move to vulnerable? Or I can.
You can
I
go ahead,
can.
Umesh.
Yeah. Okay. So when something is labeled near threatened, so the way the IUCN assessments of the species work is that a lot of funding agencies provide funds for conservation action for critically endangered species. So there are a lot of funding agencies that say if you're going to work on a critically endangered species, we'll give you money to work on it, or we'll give you money to put in place conservation action to try and protect that species. Near threatened species will almost never um, secure dedicated funding for that particular species itself. Now, whether that near threatened species moves towards vulnerable and then towards endangered and critically endangered, uh, could be that you do an assessment of the species and you find that it's near threatened. Remember, it's not yet threatened, right? It's near threatened. It's close to going into a threatened category. It's not yet threatened. It's what the assessment of the IUCN is. Now, if they redo the assessment and they find that actually, the risks were not that high, then it could go back to least concern. So we don't need to worry about this for now. But if the threats that species faces continue, then it will move from near threatened to vulnerable, and then vulnerable to endangered, and endangered to critically endangered, and ultimately, if nothing is done, then extinction. But again, uh, unfortunately, it depends on various things. What kind of species it is, political will. There's lots of random things that can also happen that could decide whether it moves in this direction, that direction. But me, your thoughts?
I think the move from near threatened to least concern would be more the exception than the norm, because having the like being able to alter the conditions that have brought about the decline of species is much more difficult. It's not that it doesn't happen. There are examples, but as Umesh said, in most cases, the conditions that promote the decline of birds are not that easy to bring down and manage easily. Sometimes it works well, if you have a very small habitat that like a restricted range species or whatever, a small habitat that you can intensively manage. You have the right kind of condition, the right political will, and all that. But I would say that is more like the exception. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
There's another question from Logan in the chat box, which is how studying the distribution of a specific bird species helps in conservation. What are the parameters to be considered while studying the distribution? Ashmi, you want to take that? Or?
Yeah, I think, okay, how studying the distribution of helps in conservation. So I think knowing the distribution is one of the essential bits of information that need to know to even assess the status of a species. If you don't have information about the distribution, like for instance, one prime example would be the forest owlet case, no, Umesh? Where because they assumed it was nocturnal for the longest time, they thought that it is found in a very restricted bit of forest in Melghat and all, and it was I think initially categorized as critically endangered or one of the higher threat categories. And eventually they figured out that it was a diurnal species, and then they started surveying it in the daytime and found that the range extends much more towards Dangs in Gujarat and much more of many other areas in central India. So so this example kind of is illustrative of the fact that unless you know the complete distribution of a species, you are not going to get an idea about the conservation status of a species. And even for ecological parameters, knowing the distribution is essential for you to even understand what are the environmental conditions, the complete set of environmental conditions that a species can occur in. So given all of that, yeah, it's one of the first things that you need to figure out if you're studying a species. And what are the parameters to be considered? Umesh, would you like to add something about the
Sure, I can.
parameters considered?
So many people who do conservation biologists do what are called species distribution models. And like Moshmi points out, first it's very very important first of all to figure out what the distribution of a species is. That's like one very very essential piece of information that you need to be able to plan any further conservation on. But a species distribution model, what it does is it says, okay, here is where this species is found. What are some of the environmental variables that this species is presented? So, for example, what is the temperature? What is the rainfall? What is the kind of habitat? And then based on that, you can you can make predictions saying if there were no barriers to the movement of this population to other suitable habitats, then this species should also be found in other places that share these environmental characteristics: habitat, temperature, rainfall, and so on. Um, Now, which of those variables you choose to include in your distribution model depends on the kind of species that you're studying. So, for some species, you might say temperature and rainfall is enough for me to predict where this species might occur. But for other, some very, very special species that uses only, certain kinds of bamboo, then I'll have to say, okay, temperature and rainfall itself is not important. I might want to take into account where this bamboo species is found. If the bamboo is found only on slopes, then I'm only going to look for areas that have slopes that where the mountains have a slope greater than, let's say, 45 degrees. All of these considerations are differ from species to species in terms of what are the parameters that you're going to put into those species distribution models. And so one of the things to that couple of the reasons why people might want to do this is to predict, okay, this species should also be found in all of these locations, and then go and see if actually it is found in those locations. If it is found that the population size is actually larger than what we thought it was, or if it's not found in those locations, but it appears that those locations are suitable for this species because it is found in those conditions in a different place, then those locations might be sites where you could reintroduce introduce this individuals of that species so that you set up more populations in other locations also. Just a couple of reasons why people might want to do this. Um, yeah, I'll give you an example with the bone musical, right? So people did a species distribution model, and they said, okay, right now we know that the range is very small; it's only 2 square kilometers. But the kind of habitat that this species occurs in is actually found in a much larger area in that region, in the western Arunachal Pradesh. So people actually went out looking for it in those locations, and they didn't find it. And so we sort of that's more evidence that the population of this species is actually range restricted, which is an important piece of information. Um, but now we're figuring out that the bone leucicula, unlike other species of leucicula, is only found uh, along very steep slopes. And so in the future, if we wanted to reintroduce, not we as in the logic of, let's say, the forest department wanted to establish more populations of the species, then you'd have to find mountainsides that have that steep slope aspect also to the um, conservation plan. Mushmi, anything else?
Nothing else to add, Umesh. Thanks. Yeah.
Okay, there's more questions in the chat box. With only 14 to 20 baboon leucicula remaining, yes, that's the correct number. Has the species passed the minimum viable population size? Is natural recovery even possible at this stage, or is intensive human intervention like captive breeding and it's now a necessity to avoid extinction? So, this species was first cited in 1996 by Professor Ramana Athreya of Indian Institute of Science Education and Research, Pune. So the first time this species was cited was in 1996. The first time it was described to science was in 2006. And since its original sighting in 1996, which is like 30 years ago, it appears that the population size has the sort of stable population size has not changed that much. It fluctuates, of course, every year when the young are born and they leave the nests. Then there's a temporary increase, and then over the winter, mortality causes the population to come back to that 14 to 20 baseline. Um, so for 30 years, if the population has been like this, it's tough to say. It's very difficult to say. Tomorrow, if there's one massive snowstorm in that area, or mosquitoes come up to high elevations and bring malaria and avian pox, which was not there in the past, and these birds might not have evolved any immunity to these diseases because they're not found um, in those areas, then the population could be very quickly wiped out. So small populations are susceptible to these kinds of things. They're susceptible to randomness. They're susceptible to environmental randomness, where one freak weather event can cause the population to go below minimum viable population size. Or there, one bad year, let's say the snake population went up very high, and a lot of the eggs were eaten, and there were no young, or very few young that particular year, then that might tip the population into being lower than minimum viable population size. Um, mm, Natural recovery would mean probably that the range of the species has to now expand. So basically, more populations have to start being established away from that 2 square kilometer area also. Is that possible at this stage? Given the speed at which settlements and agriculture is expanding, probably not. But again, I'm saying this with a huge probably. As of now, we know so little about the species that it's difficult to make predictions. Um, Captive breeding might be necessary. We're actually doing some work on not captive breeding, but doing some work on the biology of the species, trying to figure out what exactly its ecological requirements are, what its diet is, and so on. And based on that, maybe in a couple of years we'll have a much better idea of what the requirements of the species are, and whether habitat management and natural expansion is an option, or whether it's likely that captive breeding is necessary. Um, Again, like Moshe also pointed out, it's often not you know, even if you say, okay, this species, we know the ecology of this species, and it's likely to benefit from captive breeding, whether that is done or not done is another thing. That depends on political will and so on. Okay, I have another question addressed to me. Sorry, is that did I answer your question? Okay, I have another question addressed to me, which is regarding elevational shifts in birds and possibly other taxa. In the context of the Western Ghats, do species exhibit similar upslope shifts as observed in the Himalayan mountain birds under climate change, or do factors such as rainfall gradients, humidity, habitat structure, plantation, etc., play a more dominant role in shaping elevational distribution patterns in the Western Ghats? Yeah. Um, I'll just point out before we get to the Western Ghats thing that in general, species in tropical mountains tend to be more temperature sensitive than species in temperate mountains, because at higher latitudes, as you go towards the poles, the summers and the difference between the temperatures in summer and winter becomes much more stark. Um, and so tropical mountain range birds face much less variation in temperature over the annual cycle. And so they tend not to have evolved tolerance to extremes in temperature. So across the world, it's species in tropical mountains that are moving up much faster than species in temperate mountains. Now, the Western Ghats, being the north-south oriented mountain range, the southern Western Ghats are much less seasonal than the northern Western Ghats. So the northern Western Ghats species are likely to have evolved to deal with high seasonality, and they might not show as quick shifts higher up to to higher elevations. Whereas southern western Ghats species, uh, you because they're evolved to lower levels of seasonality, um, and you have the solar grassland habitat at the highest elevations in the Western Ghats, which is actually very low seasonality. So those species are likely to show the quickest elevational range shifts. Now, all the other factors that you mentioned, so rainfall gradients, humidity gradients, temperature gradients have a role to play in the speed of that movement. But things like habitat structure, plantations, and all of that are an added complicating factor to the impacts of climate change. So if you imagine that been no plantation and there's been no human habitation and no agriculture, none of that, then only climate change is causing those shifts and species move to higher elevations and they maintain viable populations. But then it depends now. If the species is forced to move and it comes into um, um, a plantation versus moving up into forest, undisturbed forest, then the consequences are going to be different for uh, in those two populations. So the forest population might be able to remain viable, whereas the population in the plantation might not be viable. So these are all things that complicate the in the Western Ghats. Actually, the plantations now at the higher elevations, it seems as if they're benefiting solar forest species because they're providing a way of moving between adjacent sholas, which was not there earlier. Earlier, it was all grassland. Now the grassland has been planted, and so now you have a habitat that, if not capable of sustaining a population, at least allows gene flow, at least allows genetic diversity to be maintained at that elevation. Is that Does that answer your question? Great.
I think the next one is also for you, Mish. Something from your slides.
All right. In the types of rarity, why were there two cells with Na? Generalist, high local abundance, and large geographic range. So something that is a generalist has high local abundance and a large geographic range is by definition not rare, right? So that's the case where if you have a combination of those three things, then you're super abundant. You're very common. So you're not rare at all. And generalist, high local abundance, and small geographic range. You're not likely to find species like that. Those species probably don't exist. Because if you're a generalist and you have high local abundance, then there's no reason why that high local abundance does not become high general abundance across a very large distributional range. Because if you're a generalist, then you should be able to expand to other habitats and other parts of other areas as well. And so you tend not to find species that are generalist and have small ranges. Um, this Nobody, you know about artificial light pollution is the next question. The question is, could you please explain how artificial light pollution could pose risks for endemic or migrating birds? For example, the Great Nicobar development projects will change nightlight ambience completely. In such cases, are more species able to adapt to these changes, and how?
Right. I also can't talk about it off the top of my head. Yeah, but
Yeah, I mean, I can't either. There is quite a bit of work.
yeah.
No, it's perfectly fine to ask. It's just that it's an emerging topic, and there is a lot of research happening on what's called ALAN, artificial light at night, and this it's taken off. We've known forever for with turtles, for sea turtles, the hatchlings when they come out at night, they need the light to to orient them towards the ocean. Not artificial light, natural light, to orient them towards the ocean, and then they get into the water. And with shore-based light, that then confuses them in their navigation, and that's probably something that might happen with birds also that use sort of the Milky Way and the patterns of the stars to migrate at night, and then the artificial light is likely to interfere with that. I unfortunately I don't know what exactly the effects are, but I could. We have another session. Suresh has a hand up. Suresh, do you want to comment on this?
Yeah, hi. Not on this one, but I have a totally different. It's not a question. I just have some doubt. This is regarding the vulture conservation and its effect on the diclofenac. I don't know if this is the right this thing to discuss here.
Sure.
Yeah, Mosmi, that's
Yeah. Suresh, please go ahead and ask. Yeah.
Okay. My question is the primary cause given everywhere for vulture declination is diclofenac. And I'm from basically, I have been in the rural background. The traditional way of disposing of these cattle is to give them, once the milching period stops, they give it for the tannery industry. Basically, what I experience in from Tamil Nadu to Kerala, it goes where the older population of the cows and the buffaloes, they are used for culling and the skin is used for the tannery. And it's been very rarely seen the disposal of these cattle in the open field. 1990, I think diclofenac was introduced, and in 2006 it was banned, if my data is not correct.
Yeah.
So how much of this diclofenac was freely available in the rural population when for the common people, even the medicine was not freely available? So the industry, the veterinary industry's availability for the B-town, C-town farmer to have this kind of access. So is it the only cause for the declination, or there may be something larger thing lurking behind this the declination which people are not able to address because easily available solution is present?
Okay. Regarding this, so particularly with vulture decline, the research was pretty comprehensive. So, and unfortunately, they didn't do much work in southern India. But along with, examining carcasses of vultures and really looking at they did autopsies and looked at the effect, the cause of death using autopsies and stuff. Apart from that, they also did like a lot of covert pharmacy surveys in rural area in northern India, central India, and eastern India, going all the way up to Assam. And they did find diclofenac very freely available. And in fact, in veterinary practices, that was the drug of choice. Like people would ask for it. The veterinarians were prescribing it left, right, and center. And even if they suggested some alternatives, people would really believed in the efficacy of the drug, and it was immensely popular. With vultures, it was one of the few species where they even conducted lethal experiments. India didn't allow for it, so they RSPB, which is the Royal Society for Protection of Birds based in UK, they managed to do those experiments in Pakistan where they were administered the drug, like healthy birds were administered the drug, and they died after, and they produced the same pathology. After being like when they performed the autopsies, they found the same pattern around of uric acid depositions around the kidney and everything. So with respect to the cause of death, it was kind of conclusively proven that it was diclofenac, and certain other, now we know that certain other drugs which are in circulation in the veterinary practice also cause similar effects. As I told you, it was also supplemented with data from covert pharmacy surveys where they just went not as researchers didn't do it. They took the help from local people who posed as farmers with cattle owners and asked for these drugs in pharmacies, and it was abundantly available in the areas that they surveyed. The third line of evidence was also from carcass dumps. So, particularly northern India, central India, there are traditional carcass dumps in villages around cities and all that. And they collected kidney samples from dead cattle in from these dumps, and there also they found enough diclofenac residues. And it was also subsequently modeled, and they figured out that less than 8% of the carcasses needed to contain diclofenac for it to have caused the decline that was seen. So there are like multiple lines of evidence that were used to pinpoint the cause of vulture decline.
Okay, thank you. Thanks a lot. Is there any further studies you can recommend where I can go through it? Is it available across the Indian subcontinent, or there is some variation based on the regional behavioral activities of the dumping or the consumption of the meat and other things?
Unfortunately, they haven't looked at variation across the country. But unfortunately, southern India was missed out in these surveys. But overall, BNHS has worked in the rest of the country, and there they don't find much variation.
Okay, so the tannery industry supply was not been influencing this one of the dumping of the carcass in the wild.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I could share some papers with Amrita, and she can pass them on to you if you are interested in reading.
Sure, thank you.
So we can answer one more question.
Yeah, that's on acoustic monitoring. Moshmi, you want to take that, or should I?
You can go ahead. I have no experience with this.
Okay. I actually have no experience with acoustic monitoring because we don't do it in our research. But one of the problems with acoustic monitoring is that for anything, whether it's for studying rangers or anything else, or even trying to figure out what the bird community is at a particular location, is that
Sorry, Harshita, can you please mute? Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, one of the problems with acoustic monitoring is that you can place the recorders out there. That's very easy to do, right? Like you place camera traps to monitor tigers. You can just place the recorder there, and the recorder will record um, whatever is singing and whatever is. So it's picking up things that are going to be singing or going to be calling. There's a lot of species that might not do that, and you'll not be able to pick those up because they're silent. So that's one problem with acoustic monitoring. Don't worry about it, Harshita. So you're only going to pick up. So this is an issue of detectability, right? You're picking up species that are vocal, but you're missing out on species that tend to remain silent. And so there might be parts of the year where many species just don't sing at all, right? And so that's one issue. The second thing is we've not yet in India, we've not yet um, automated the process of being able to identify every single bird species in their recordings. So, for that, somebody who has experience with birds in that particular region is a much better, much far better way to monitor species. So, instead of taking, as of now, and this is my understanding of it, um, as of now, we don't have the know-how to take recordings and then run them through a pipeline and then get the species, all the species that there are in that recording reliably. So, for example, in our study site, which is the Eastern Himalayas, you've got, it's the second highest species richness of bird species in the world after the Andes Amazon gradient, and you might need to be able to identify 650, 700 species by sight and sound, which is something that the acoustic monitoring is right now unable to do. Whereas if you have somebody out in the field who knows this, has spent 8 years, 10 years learning all these species, then that person is far more reliable as a source of information or source of data than acoustic monitoring. That's the situation now. I don't know, with AI and all of that and training these tools to be able to pick up different species and how fast that's moving, the reality might be completely different in the future. But again, one of the other things is with acoustic monitoring is that you're not getting the gain of information that you get from a field study that involves misletting or tagging or radio tagging, because there you're getting information on the individual level. And so we're able to also look at things like survival rates and reproductive rates, movement of individuals across season, which is all information that you're not going to get from passive acoustic monitoring, which is information at the species level.
Yeah, thank you so much, Umesh. I think, yeah.
Yeah, there aren't any more questions in the chat.
Yeah. So,
just one comment. Hello.
yes,
This
yes.
is Gautam. Yeah, Dr. Umesh, you had mentioned in your talk that the birds which live in flock, okay, when they are revived, okay, the interaction ability is not coming back as it was earlier. You had mentioned that the birds which live in flocks are foraging in flocks and all those sort of this thing, and when they are revived or see, the whatever is lost is not fully brought back. That you had mentioned in your lecture. It was very, yes, in your talk probably. Okay. You had made a mention that, say, if there is a community living, okay, if that is disturbed, even if it is, let's say, revived back, something is lost. The community, the interactive characteristics, traits of these birds is lost. That was probably made, one statement was made, which looked very, very critical or crucial or important for me. Okay. I think I'll specifically note that. It just registered in my mind when I heard your talk and made that set of mention. In your talk on concepts, conservation concepts, you had made one comment like. I'll specifically pick a point and indicate that to note. Okay.
Okay, right. Yeah, that's probably in response to the Cameron Watt paper from fragments in Brazilian Amazonian rainforest, where the flocks break down when the fragmentation happens, and you lose. You have the species continue to be there in the fragments, but they don't join flocks anymore because some of the species that are important in initiating and maintaining those flocks, those species are lost from forest fragments.
Yeah, and that's the exact comment. Yeah, that's the comment. Yeah. Yes. Very nice. Thank you. Thank you.
So I think we'll wind up the session today. If you have any further queries regarding this lecture, please post your query in the discussion forum. I know your exams are coming close, April 17th. And yeah, please post your questions. I'll always try to get back as soon as possible. I get the response from faculties. So thank you so much, Umesh, And thank you, Mausami, for joining. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Anita.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Thank you, Ramesh.
Yeah.